Let's Talk Call-In Radio. Yes, this is Let's Talk Call-In Radio, getting to the root causes of the important issues of the day. This on-the-air community forum believes your voice matters and welcomes all thoughts and views without judgment. Please join today's conversation by calling 415-663-8492 or 8317. And when you call in, you'll hear a noise as I put you into the system, a little grrr noise. You'll go into the system. Please wait until I say you're on the air, and then give us a name, turn down your radio, and please keep the language clean, because this is live radio, so we need to
I've got a question for you, Paul.
Keep back all those nasty swear words. You have a question for me already.
I want to know how long that prohibition from being silly is going to last.
Being silly?
You said, and don't do anything silly.
Oh, well.
I want to know how long
till this
can
afternoon.
I apply that to myself.
Till 5 p.m. So today's subject, every week we discuss a subject among the co-hosts. Oh, by the way, my lovely co-host, Stephen Hurwitz, is here today. Shelley Rugg is out of town, and one of our usual co-hosts. A lot of people are out of town. I'm Paul Raffel. We might have a special guest co-host joining us soon after she's walked the dog. So every week we talk about topics, most of which the people in this studio know very little about, but we do a little homework every week, and we discuss the little that we do know and hope that listeners will call in 415-663-8492 or 8317 to shed some light on the topics that we discuss. And this week, it's kind of a big topic, and it's not really a what can we do about it topic, but I was listening to an interview with the ex-commissioner, UN Commissioner, High Commissioner for Human Rights, who resigned this year mainly because the U.S. is pulling out of funding the UN Human Rights Commission, and he didn't feel that he could say what he really had to say about human rights excesses in the world if it was about the U.S., Russia, China, all the big boys. He didn't feel free to be able to express his opinion, to tell the truth.
Wasn't he asked to sort of tone it down?
He was asked to tone it down by someone who used to be the High Commissioner for Refugees, who is now he's the Secretary General now. What's his name? His name is Antonio Guterres. Yeah, he was asked to tone it down a little bit because he was being critical of what all the big powers are doing overseas, mostly in other countries, but also in this country. He's critical of the death penalty. He's critical of just this week we're reducing the number of refugees we're going to allow into the country down to 30,000 from 200,000 or something, 150,000. So we're talking about human rights, and I'm kind of interested if anyone out there thinks that human rights are obviously a human construct. There's no such thing as rights. really, for species. Other
Certainly
than us.
hasn't been considered rights for an awful long time in human history.
I mean, human rights, really? What do we deserve? We seem to have a list of rules available to us to tell us what to do and what not to do to each other. And why is that? We're joined in the studio by our lovely co-host, Sally Phillips, who can be heard all the time on this radio station.
No, not nearly enough. Why, if I were to exercise my full rights that I've bestowed upon myself, it would be the Sally Phillips Radio Network.
The Sally Phillips Radio Networks, SPRN. And we were talking outside, and Stephen said, well, this, the human rights...
I don't remember what I said.
Called?
Did I say something?
Commission?
The Human Rights Commission, but
tone it down. I think
UN,
I talked about being asked to tone it down.
Anyway, the list that was drawn up of things that comprise human rights was 1946, I believe.
Oh, I see.
Or the Commission for Human Rights, as it now is, it was called something else in 1946. And,
I think I was talking earlier about this being really written for first world countries, industrialized countries, and that underdeveloped and undeveloped countries have really, it doesn't apply them at all. Spirit of brotherhood does, but I think the vague things might apply, but the specific things are, I don't think they're written with those people in mind.
Really? Because it ends up being that most of the time Human Rights Commission is talking about developing countries rather than what's going on in the U.S. And when, as we see, when they do talk about developed countries, the big powers in the world, they are censured. And the reason the U.S. is withdrawing 20% of the funding for the Human Rights Commission is that they talk too much about Israel. They're not pro-Israel enough. They're always talking about how, John Bolton,
Shocking.
I think that's the fundamentalist Christian input there. Israel is one of their big subjects. Abortion, Israel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you got to bring on Armageddon. That's where it's going to be.
That's right. In fact, they should be promoting the unrest
it's just
in
amazing.
Israel.
When you think the whole thing is based on like a Bible story, a myth, it's so bizarre. The fundamentalist
that's
Christian.
a whole other subject. Myths.
Yes, it is.
Well, okay, so the other thing is that I was reading an article or in a blog about animal rights versus human rights. So, I don't know, that's a whole other topic maybe, or is it? Because humans are animals. But it's just that we have been compelled to create human rights policy as a result of, and you talk about the developed countries, the Western and big Eastern nations, because we're the ones that have perpetrated the greatest atrocities on the greatest scale. So as the balance tips, then we try to create after World War II and what the Japanese did in Nanking and these, incredible atrocities.
I'm just wondering, though.
Then you have to create policy.
Yeah, it's the Declaration of Human Rights.
I mean, I don't
Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
I don't see a pack of elephants, wantonly terrorizing another pack of elephants by tying them up and turning them into target practice and, atrocities. So I don't know.
I'm just going to suggest that we take another look at, not now, but this business of, like you said, the Western world committing the gravest atrocities. I'm not sure that's...
That may, no, I'm not. I didn't mean to imply that. There's also, the Armenian genocide. I mean, there are genocides throughout human history. So after
Rwanda, the Tutsis and the Hutus,
exactly.
Bosnia,
there are genocides at the
Myanmar. So
Myanmar. I just there is actually a 444-page document by the UN written about by the special rapporteur. They have what they call special rapporteurs who go in and study and interview people and do deep studies and write reports on human rights violations. So, wonderful work the UN is doing. And is it making a difference? Call in, won't you? 415-663-8492 if you think the UN is as wonderful a body and a great idea that it is. 70 years after its formation, it's still going on. Things are getting slightly better in this country. But in other countries, Saudi Arabia, women can drive now. I don't know. They do wonderful work on documenting human rights violations, but is it actually making a difference?
Well, I think when you shed light on something, painful though it may be, it raises awareness, and raising awareness has historically been able to instigate change, no matter how incremental it may be. So, we think about. I think another thing I'm pondering is human rights is important because of the colonial concept that these people over here are savages. Mm-hmm. And we know better. So that the idea people who are better educated or more whatever, quote, better educated in a system, are more sophisticated and able to be the caretakers and to lead this other group of people who know what's right. Yeah, like taking in it's historically indigenous peoples, like Aboriginal peoples in Australia have been appallingly treated. I mean, horrendous, as in Native Americans, as in so on and so forth.
Yeah, Sally, but what I'm saying is that's missing from this document. There's really no mention of, the colonialist behavior. It's really the behavior that it's for Europeans and Americans, by Europeans and Americans, and really directed towards issues that are really coming from World War II and stemming from violence. This stuff, doesn't recognize the genocide, the American genocide of the Indians.
So it doesn't go nearly far enough, and I think you need people like Ta-Nehisi Coates in our culture who makes a case for reparations for African Americans. I mean, that was never something that anyone thought of, or they thought of it, but maybe it was a fleeting thought, or this couldn't possibly happen. I think
it is part of the recommendations at the end of the 444-page report on Myanmar and the Rohingya people being massacred and driven away. It does say reparations. It does mention reparations. So that is part of the UN agenda when it's trying to document human rights violations. But again, nothing stopped that ethnic cleansing in Myanmar. There was a lot of attention to it. Aung San Suu Kyi, a Nobel Peace Prize winner, is basically the prime minister of Myanmar. She didn't do anything to stop it. In fact, she denied that the military was engaging in any kind of killings.
Well, I wouldn't just expect some wonderful behavior from her. She had one major issue, and the rest of it,
Her major issue was fighting against the military government in Myanmar, and she was in prison for like 20 years or so. So you would think she would be more outspoken against the military. Oh, apparently she is not in a position to do so.
How many Nelson Mandelas?
Well, exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Winnie Mandela.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I guess there's actually a question, an existential question. Should we even worry about human rights? People are going to kill people in vast numbers because that's what happens, especially under capitalist and totalitarian regimes. And we love our capitalist regimes and we love our totalitarian regimes. And when power...
Speak for yourself.
When power... Well, here we are in a wonderful capitalist society, and there's the biggest prison population in the world. There's, all that.
Biggest prison industry.
Yeah.
The prison industrial complex.
No programs for poor are being defunded. All that. Social welfare programs are trying to be defunded. They're trying to defund them again. It's just this constant barrage of the elite, the wealthy, or whatever, the ones in power, pushing down those who are not in power. And that happens all over the world under every regime.
You know what I find so shocking?
What's that?
They're lurking amongst people are all these resentments and murderous thoughts by their neighbors that for many generations or whatever it is, there's no outward manifestation of that, and then something will happen, and all of a sudden this emerges, and it's been hiding there for all this time, and just if the right circumstances exist, boom, out it comes.
Well, as in Europe, you mean the rising of nationalism in Europe again, Yes,
415-663-8492 is the number you can call to join the discussion here on Let's Talk on KWMR. 415-663-8492.
Does the Declaration of Human Rights have any teeth? Let's put it that way. There's one question. Does the UN itself have any teeth? Does it actually create change? Again, a wonderful idea. Communism started out as a wonderful idea. Capitalism, when it's done with compassion, is a wonderful idea. They're all wonderful ideas. Unions are, of course, a wonderful idea. But once all these systems, these isms and creations of humans get powerful and get more money, and there's political power involved, then everything starts to change a little bit. I wonder if, the UN, especially the Human Rights Commission, we're pulling funding. We're pulling the U.S. funding from it, so basically it's going to go down. They're not going to be able to do the work they're doing. Maybe its time has come. Maybe it's time to stop worrying about human rights violations. What do you think? 415-663-8492.
Is it that no one is really implementing the directives
of
the Human Rights Declaration?
They did because this is just the most recent one, the report in Myanmar, 444 pages, wonderfully, really thorough. They interviewed 1,000 people all in different places and tried to keep them all anonymous so there wouldn't be reprisals, that kind of thing. I mean, it's all very painstakingly done by wonderful people, but obviously by a paid staff, and it outlines everything. It outlines the atrocities, the murders, the mass deportations, the pushing out of villages. They're not allowed to be citizens. This is the problem. I don't know if you know about the Rohingya. They're not allowed to be citizens of Burma because they are not one of the original 8 races in Burma, in Myanmar. So they're basically stateless people, and Bangladesh doesn't want them. That's where they go, is to Bangladesh, because that's the border, and they don't want them.
I think that's one of the rights, to be part of a state.
Yeah, well, there you go. So we can write it down and say that's a right.
When you read the articles of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I mean, each article is sort of ideologically, or not ideologically, in practice being kind of splattered all over the pavement. I mean, none of these things are really being defended. I mean, like the right to... everyone has the right to freedom of movement and residence within the borders of each state. You know, I don't know. There's something in here about marriage. I don't know. People are always selling their children off to marriage at age 10 in certain places. And I mean, how do you... I don't even know how you...
Well, this is the thing.
I'm overwhelmed. I can't even finish the sentence. I'll be quiet.
There are 30 articles that lay out what good behavior would be for a government, right? I mean, it's like the 10 Commandments, only there's 30. And it's the ideal way for humans to behave. And, of course, humans are not going to behave ideally. So, anyway, we have a caller. Caller, you are on the air. What's your name, please?
Good morning, everybody. It's Seattle MK calling.
Hey, MK.
I'm sitting here trying to think of something intelligent to say to add to your conversation going on there. And the only thing I can come up with is the way things are in this country right now. It just seems to me that we're all questioning what we can believe and what we can't believe, and everything's all mucked up and muddied up, and you can't figure out if there are any real rights or it's just a bunch of words or what. So that's kind of where I am on this.
Especially at this time when another Supreme Court judge is being put up, being investigated, basically. What will he do? What will the Supreme Court do to the Constitution, which is it's a Declaration of Human Rights. It was maybe one of the first one. Magna Carta, I suppose, was the original. But, it's a Declaration of Human Rights. And can we say that not only has it needed, 29 amendments? I would say that a lot of the human rights outlined in our Constitution are not being adhered to. So what will the new makeup of the Supreme Court do for
And when we have
a
leader, in quotation marks, who just makes up his own rules as he goes along and can do pretty much anything he wants, and we're forced to listen, or I guess it's a choice to listen to the news. But when we do listen to the news, we have to hear about mushrooms and you know what I'm talking about. And who what's disgusting, how dehumanizing is it all? It's really hard to know where to be.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you're talking about this because I'm in a muddle.
Yeah. Well, certainly the UN now. There is a woman who used to live in West Marin who works at the UN, or used to work at the UN, and was very loved the idea of it, loved working there, actually. I would love it if she were listening, and she would call in, but she probably isn't. But it's a great thing. It's the Supreme Court is a wonderful thing. It's all these ideas are fabulous until politics and power come into them all,
right,
and human nature, right?
One of the things that stands out to me is that when you read these, a lot of it is the superimposition of the American Constitution. And, they sort of plopped it down. Obviously, the United States had a big part of this, but they sort of plopped all that stuff down in there.
Exactly. Well, so wonderful to be an inspiration to all the other member states, that the U.S. Constitution should actually be an inspiration for a Declaration of Human Rights. Doesn't mean that we're adhering to them or that anyone else will. It's nice to have a list, like it's nice to have a list of laws that keep you from murdering people.
It represents a great deal of thought and intention and idealism, and it's a document that's meant to be a roadmap for doing the right thing, and it's a mission statement of the Founding Fathers. So, and it's alive. It's the document sort of is alive and malleable, and what is happening is that some people come in who are utterly or essentially fundamentalists. So these might be the same people, or it's akin to reading the Bible in a very literal fashion. They're reading the document of our Constitution in an extremely literal fashion without taking into account changes in society and in time and history. People like Clarence Thomas.
Originalists.
Yes.
There shouldn't have been any
it's
amendments.
Fundamentalism, and so that's the danger, is when you get into interpretation, and then how does that document get affected by that reading, and then how is our society affected by that reading?
It's absurd, actually. Their position it's absurd.
Yeah. MK, any more thoughts?
I love the word absurd. My father told me that the only way to survive this life is to have a well-developed sense of the absurd, and he was right. It seems to me now that there's so much self-serving going on that it's like okay, I'm in the Senate and I've been elected and I'm a Republican and so now I can pretty much do whatever I want, or is there some great big something going on behind the scenes that's pushing everybody so far to the right and I just don't know, and I guess I'm not an idealist. It's a simple-minded artist.
It's disturbing to watch, I would say.
It is. It's very disturbing,
and who's to stop it? See, this is the thing. Is there any teeth in the UN when the UN is run by the very countries that are turning nationalist and don't care about the UN? Like, we are taking funding away from all kinds of things at the UN. Nikki Haley and John Bolton. Oof.
See, I'm hearing from you, though, this really under it all, that you think perhaps the end of the UN maybe should be abolished, that the UN, that nice building, turned into, somebody's headquarters.
Or the Alfred Hitchcock North by Northwest Memorial Building.
Maybe Amazon should buy it.
A bouncy house. Right?
A big bouncy house. MK, you just said that was really good.
The bouncy console.
The world's tallest house. Talk about absurdity.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, MK.
Even if 45 goes away, which I hope will happen, but then what? It's like
Exactly.
there's so much sludge in the pipes that it's gonna be hard to ream it all out.
Yes, and ideological momentum.
Yeah, plumber-esque.
That's a good word.
Well, yeah. Thank you so much for your thoughts, MK, as always.
They weren't very enlightening, but whatever. Okay, hang in there.
It was wonderful.
Stay fireless, please.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks,
Bye.
MK. Bye. 415-663-8492 is one of the numbers here. Do give us a call. Meanwhile, the Marin County Fire Chiefs Association has, there is still a red flag warning in effect for Marin County until 5 p.m. this afternoon. The National Weather Service has issued a red flag warning for the North Bay Mountains and other parts of the Bay Area, which is in effect until Thursday, September 20th at 5 p.m. That's today. The red flag warning means critical fire weather conditions are expected during this time frame, meaning strong winds, gusts, and low humidity. Marin, Napa, and Sonoma counties. Yes, there are closures at parks all over the place. Mount Vision Road. All open burning and burn permits are suspended on public lands. All watershed land use permits are cancelled. And closures to Mount Tam State Park. Roads north of Panoramic Highway are closed to motor vehicle traffic on Pantol Road and Ridgecrest Boulevard, etc., etc. Please use extreme caution during a red flag warning, because a simple spark could cause a major wildfire. Use of equipment and machinery as well as smoking. And, may I say, in my opinion, clear glass bottles on the side of the road. So, yes. And support for KWMR. This is KWMR 90.5 in Point Reyes Station, 89.9 Bolinas, 92.3 San Geronimo Valley, online kwmr.org. And we're supported by the California Film Institute, celebrating film and media as art, entertainment, and education at the Christopher B. Smith Raphael Film Center, the Mill Valley Film Festival, and through CFI education programs. Information at cafilm.org. And media support for KWMR is provided by the Point Reyes Light, family-owned since 1948, providing local news every Thursday in print and online. Open Monday through Thursday in downtown Inverness with information on classifieds, subscriptions, advertising, and more at ptreyeslight.com or at 415-669-1200. And the number in the studio here is 415-663-8492 or 8317 to call in and give us your thoughts about human rights, especially in light of the UN Human Rights Council, the High Commissioner resigning because he didn't feel he could speak out properly. The new commissioner is Michelle Bachelet, who was president of Chile for a while. And, of course, Chile, back in the old Pinochet days, all the desaparecidos, all the children, people, anyone who raised a voice was summarily disappeared and taken off to the Atacama Desert.
Well, that's a good example, though, of a country that came through the darkness and came out the other side.
Exactly, because, what, he died? Or because there
was a takeover, wasn't it?
There was, I don't think, did the UN have any international criminal courts? It was the people,
the people rising up.
Sure. Finally, and the military finally going...
It's a scary proposition. It's the ultimate scary thing for people to rise up because you can be run over by tanks and gunned down in the streets, which has happened in our own country.
Syria is probably the best example right now of people rising up disastrously. You know, I'm sorry to butt in so often, but I came up with something that I think something that would apply more to underdeveloped countries in terms of human rights, and I'm just going to read, there's just like 5 of them, so I'm going to read them. The right to safe and adequate housing, I think, is very important, and so many people don't have that. The access to clean water, that's another, I mean, so simple, we take it so for granted, and yet, women will travel an hour back and forth to just bring water.
In Flint, Michigan.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, another one is the fair distribution of food, and again, that isn't happening. I'm adding the children not being responsible for the debts of their parents. That is that's a big one.
Is that a human right, really, or is that just something?
Well, can you elaborate on that one?
Yeah.
What I mean.
Well,
I'm not clear what it means.
In some places, you have a debt that the parents have, and they die, and their children are responsible for their debts. It just carries on to the children. Sort of, I think college debts do that as well. I'm not sure.
I wonder what's the other side of that. Are they allowed to inherit from their parents? Carry on.
And the last one is the freedom from arbitrary and violent governance. Those are the things that came to my mind that would apply to underdeveloped nations.
But how does this differ? I mean, apart from the loan thing, forgiveness, how does this differ from the actual Declaration on Human Rights? I mean, that's all in there. I mean, that's basically what the Declaration's about. Yeah. No, you're bringing it down to specifics, which is good. I would say, as the example, water, Flint, and elsewhere in this
come
country.
on.
Well, elsewhere in this country where
That's
for example,
been years since they've had. I mean, children are all brain damaged from lead.
Fine, but I'm talking about hundreds of millions of people in Africa.
Of course. Yes. But it's all
they don't have access to clean water, or if they do, it's so difficult. Like I said, women will travel. It takes a big part of their day just to get it.
But then,
Agreed.
It may be a right. Is that a right? You have to do something about it. You can't just say this is a right. You can't. What are you going to? You're going to walk to the village and say you have the right to clean water. Oh, thank you.
So we keep coming back to
the UN comes in and does some of that.
Right. We keep coming back to enforcement, I think.
Yeah. Enforcement and doing something on the ground. Right.
And if it's not in the interests of the powers that be to enforce, because what it comes down to, of course, color me Mrs. Oversimplification over here in the corner,
I think we're...
Because really political science is not my forte. It's just that you have to have the will. There has to be the collective will in the governing structure to enable this and to develop infrastructure or to set up something to, I don't know.
Well, I'm not saying that this exists. I'm saying that this is a human right, and that's something that we need to aim for.
It has to be enforced and enabled.
It's a major deficit in terms of people living, and I just don't think the document directly addresses that.
Addresses things in specifics like that.
Yeah, it goes down to something really basic, which this document has not really doesn't address rights to clean water, for crying out loud.
Clean water, clean air. No.
Well, add that. Yeah, that's important.
Clean, no 5G cell towers. All that, all the things we're doing to ourselves. Again. It's the same thing as with human rights as they're more commonly thought of, which is freedom from repression, freedom to vote, freedom to have your say without being shot, freedom from being shot, basically. That's
violent and arbitrary governance.
Right. So those are basic human rights. When it's the major powers that are the police, and they are not living up to in their own countries, they're not living up to human rights. How do we expect anything to happen? This is the thing. They're governed. The UN is basically funded by the major powers, and all the other nations are there, and they all have a voice. In theory, they all have a voice, but they all have to align themselves with one big country or two big countries, whoever is going to be in their best interest to do so. Who's going to give them a hydroelectric dam, right? Who's going to build us a hydroelectric dam in Sri Lanka?
But isn't it incremental?
Lesotho. Okay, we'll go with the Russians or the Chinese. Is it incremental? I don't know. Is it getting better? How about the human right to have a climate that is not affected by what we're all doing to it? Is that a human right? Because that's going to be the big thing that's going to cause the most deaths, the most war, the most horrible stuff all around the world.
It is
atrocities around the world will
Island nations are going underwater.
Yeah, and wars are going to happen because of
Manhattan.
Because there's no water. There will be no water in places where there has been some. People are going to want to move. And when that happens, here we go. So what is the UN going to... Does the UN as a body have any power to do anything about this? This is the thing. I mean, they have wonderful programs. They have the peacekeepers, the blue helmets going out there and trying to keep people apart. But really, if the sides want to blow each other up, they're going to blow each other up. And if the UN gets in the way, they just get in the way.
Isn't a lot of this, though... being being implemented by non-governmental groups more. I mean, Doctors Without Borders, for example.
Yes.
Human Rights Watch.
Yeah. Groups that go in and provide, who drill wells in villages. It's not necessarily a government.
No. Well, so if you look at the UN, it's basically a non-governmental. It's not one government doing it. It's run by governments or funded by states, but really it's like a huge non-profit. Except apparently everyone is very well paid who's at the UN, but who works for the UN. It's a great job in New York. And they're doing wonderful things. 415-663-8492. Let's hear a defense of the United Nations if you feel like it. Or just give us your thoughts about human rights and what the record has been, what the future might be. What's the answer to situations like the Rohingyas?
Well, I see a deterioration of human rights. In particular, I imagine there's going to be a mass migration take place on the planet, and that is going to undermine human rights on a massive scale. Just one of the things that I see coming.
Again, Europe, the center of civilization, is becoming a series of nationalist nations again. Despite the efforts of the EU to bring everyone together in a common cause, blah blah blah, they're all going to become nationalist nations again. It's us and against the world, and they're not going to allow when people from the southern hemisphere or from the equatorial region start coming up to where maybe there will still be some water up in the northern hemisphere, up in Europe and
that's
elsewhere,
the beginning of the
States,
migrations. And
they're not going to let them in. We've seen that already. We're not letting them in. 30,000, that's this year. Next year, they're not sending their best,
Well, I think one of the answers is to promote good jobs in the countries that border. I say that people from Mexico like Mexico in many. A lot of these people that come over here are actually sending money back.
Of course,
to
yes,
families.
That's correct.
Given the opportunity, I'd like to know if they could get good jobs and if they had adequate access to the things I'm talking about, would they want to come to the United States?
No, of course
and
not.
I'm guessing they wouldn't. So if we want to protect our borders, we need to go down there. I'd say bring those jobs back from China and send them to Mexico.
Well, Mexico has a flourishing manufacturing.
And Trump is doing everything he can to diminish that. I mean, now he doesn't want auto parts imported from Mexico, assembly plants in Mexico.
Yeah, well, that's just silly. But we were all against, there was a big outcry, let's just put it that way, against NAFTA, the effects of NAFTA. And we all know that part of the effects of NAFTA was to bring subsidized American corn and beans across the border to Mexico, driving peasant farmers off the land. That's part of the reason there was such a great migration to the north. How do that would seem like a human right to be able to grow things to support yourself and your family, to send them to market. I mean, that's basic human behavior, right? Since we started putting things in the ground and make them grow. That seems to me that's a basic human right, to be allowed to do that. If you have a piece of land where you can grow things, or commons or something, where you can grow food for your family and to make a livelihood.
Well, that's
we
another
took that away from
thing that Stephen's talking
hundreds
about.
of thousands of people in Mexico. No, yeah, of course they're going to come
not
here.
to mention farmers all over, thanks to Monsanto, who were suing individual farmers.
Is it a human right to be protected from multinational corporations?
Yeah, like I say, these are living documents. They need, I think they need tending and growing. These these documents, and then they need some kind of enforcing or implementation.
But who's to do it? The International Criminal Court? Nobody.
Maybe international criminals.
The U.S. doesn't pay attention to any findings. Russia certainly doesn't.
I'm old enough to remember the Green Revolution. Back in the 50s, people, they saw the population bomb, and they said, okay, how are we going to feed all these people? And they had this thing called the Green Revolution.
Monsanto.
And Monsanto and other chemical companies said, hey, we're gonna use our powers, and they had these chemicals that could do it, and we're going to create agricultural, essentially industries that can feed the world. Mm-hmm. So the initiation of this was not necessarily evil intentions. Mm-hmm. It just ended up that way.
Yeah, well, when they disregard, when they fight science that shows that they're actually doing harm because they're making such huge profits, yes, of course, that's evil, I suppose. I'm not sure I believe in evil as
do you remember, Stephen, there was Percy, was his name Percy Schneider? Oh, I can't. A farmer in Canada who was like the lone fighter of Monsanto. He was suing Monsanto. This was several years ago, 10, 15 years ago, and I have his name slightly wrong here. Because the spores were floating over into his crops, and therefore Monsanto was actually trying to sue him
for patent violation.
Yeah, and so he was fighting back, and there was some. I mean, I wonder whatever happened to this farmer, this brave man.
The brilliance of their attack.
Farmers in India are committing suicide over this.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, well, in India, in India, there's been a lot of this, and now it's a movement that's happening in more places, right?
Yes.
Yeah, 415-663-8492. Give us a call. We're talking about human rights. What does it mean? What do they mean? How can we enforce human rights?
Only to stop me from speaking about things I don't know anything about.
Hey, that's what this show is all about, I keep saying.
Percy Schmeiser is the farmer from Bruno, Saskatchewan. He was the one that was involved in a long, protracted legal battle with Monsanto. Mm-hmm. So he was the David to their Goliath, and I don't really know what happened.
What the outcome was, they probably ran out of money, and they didn't. Maybe.
And it was Roundup Ready canola that he discovered in his fields. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
which they said would never happen. Oh, it can't spread. There was an interesting article, which was also part of the reason I thought about doing this week, the case against human rights. This was an article in The Guardian by Eric Posner, who I believe is an economics professor in the U.S. at Chicago. Oh, international distress signal. And he frames it all in economic terms, that we can't afford human rights anymore.
There's
a
comfortable rationalization.
Yeah. Caller, you're on the air. What's your name, please?
Hi, Paul. This is Hal at Marconi. How are you?
Hey, Hal.
Just quickly, and actually before I get to it, I don't know if anyone else experiences this, but I'm at my desk, and I was hesitant to use my adding machine because it makes a lot of noise, as though you guys would hear it before I even get on the phone with you. It's just a weird thing.
An adding machine.
Oh, that's good. You're being mindful.
I want to quote Law and Order and Jack McCoy. He said, "We have only those rights we can defend. Only those rights," he emphasized. We touch on it, but ultimately we got to figure out a way of asserting those rights and defending those rights, and then we can get around to figuring out what they are, because it's all pretty empty unless that means of defending those rights.
What does that defense look like?
Wow. Well, Jack McCoy would say in a court of law. but where are we when our rights are taken away from us? Confused by the fact that we all think more in terms of our own personal rights, and not when we trespass into the rights of other people.
Mm-hmm.
I guess probably that we're not organized.
Right. Well, and again, how do you can take a person to court? How do you take a state to court? How do you make them change their behavior unless it's...
If you can take a person to court, it probably is something that
it happens
you
all
can
the
win
time.
at.
There are millions of lawsuits against the state. I'm just reminded of Amy Goodman's, the name of her show, Freedom is a Constant Struggle. And I think that's what I'm hearing.
Yeah, and it was actually, if you want to get back to the Constitution, it was supposed to be. I mean, from the very beginning, we knew we were trying to lay a foundation for defending those rights, but we're clever people, and we figure out ways around that as we move forward.
Yeah. And so all the amendments happen. I mean, some of them are because of new ideas, new social thinking.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's a great thing that it's a living document. Although, as we said earlier, the justices that are being brought in are originalists and don't necessarily believe in any of the amendments.
No, and look at I'm not a gun advocate, but those who are and defend the Second Amendment do so largely, or to some extent anyway, believing that at a certain point they're going to need guns to defend themselves from federal agencies.
Right. And ironically, they're also the biggest supporters of our military. Who do you think's coming for the guns, guys?
Yeah, and
if that ever happens.
Would a president actually
ways of dealing with that? But ultimately, I think people like guns because they're cool and make them feel like it's a way of getting control back in their lives.
Yeah. Well, all good points. Thank you, Hal.
Sure. Just wanted to bring up Jack McCoy.
Thanks very much. That's great.
Right. Take care.
663-415-663-8492. Give us a call. We have a couple of minutes left.
Well, do we have a right to maintain weapons? Do we have a right to?
In this country, you do.
Yeah. What about the world? Is that a human right?
Is it a human right?
Yeah,
to
the ability to defend yourself on the level of
the military.
Well, of these dangerous countries who are violent governance and violent organizations.
You have a right to defend yourself, I think, pretty much anywhere, unless it's a government official. And then it gets tricky, doesn't it? And if the government official is coming to enforce laws, then you have no right to resist them. That's how that works under law, right?
The Eisenhower sending in federal troops to enforce integration of school. That was a major move.
Huge.
Huge.
Yes. No, there have been many high spots, high points. Things have gotten certainly better. They're not. I mean, they've gone about abolishing unions, for example. They've gone about destroying unions in other ways, more financial than anything else. Whereas in the old days, they'd just send in a bunch of guys, they'd pay a bunch of guys to go in with pickaxe handles and beat them all up. But they don't have to do that anymore because money talks. And yes. Here's an interesting passage in the last couple of minutes here from this article about the case against human rights. It says Central problem with human rights is that it is hopelessly ambiguous. The ambiguity which allows governments to rationalize almost anything they do is not a result of sloppy draftsmanship, but of the deliberate choice to overload the treaties with hundreds of poorly defined obligations. Take the right not to be tortured, for example. In most countries, torture is not a matter of official policy. As in Brazil, local police often use torture because they believe it's an effective way to maintain order or solve crimes. Yes, anyway. In truly international human rights institutions such as the UN Human Rights Council, there is a drastic lack of consensus between nations. To avoid being compelled by international institutions to recognize rights that they reject, countries give them little power. It goes on. It's all about, the problem with human rights is that humans are in charge of enforcing them.
Yeah.
If it were hamsters doing it, they might do a better job.
I have a friend whose slogan is, where there's humans, where there's people, there's trouble.
Yes, exactly. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to our listeners. Thanks to our callers. We really appreciate it when people call in. Thank you, Sally.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you for the privilege.
And I'm Paul, and we'll leave you with a little bit of music here. Thanks, everybody. See you next week.